been 20 or 22 years since you started USV. You've been investing for decades, even before that. You've been doing this for a long time. Have had a lot of success. Jared posted a picture on Twitter a couple weeks ago of the two of you sitting back to back in two offices, two rooms in our office, with the caption, like, these two guys are always the first two here in the morning, which is true. People often ask me, why are you guys still here?
Well, for me, venture capital is a little bit of a crutch. I'm very curious, but I'm a little lazy in terms of doing the work to learn something. And venture capital allows me to learn all these new things without having to do a lot of work. And then, of course, that's supercharged by all the founders who come in and explain a really deep domain. I can't get that anywhere else. I could potentially go get it at another venture firm, but I don't know why I would want to do that. I already have one, so like, why do I need to go get another one? But like, I can't give that up. Like, I don't know where else to get that.
When you're sitting across the table from an entrepreneur who's been thinking deeply about a problem for a long time, you can go, no, I get that part. Tell me about this. I don't get this part. And so it just zeroes you right in on, and it just accelerates your learning. And so same story. It's an incredible privilege to be able to, sit with smart people, talk about really interesting things. At my point in my career, as I'm trying to step back, I like to say, smart people, cool things, don't take any to-dos, which is, a great spot to be in.
Yeah, it is really a wonderful thing to be able to, almost interrogate. And I realize when I'm with founders, I kind of do that. I realize that that's my UI. To interrogate a founder, that's, for me, the greatest way to learn. It, like you said, Brad, it's a real privilege because they're only doing that because we can write them a check. They're not coming in to educate us out of the goodness of their hearts, but that's what we get from it.
And it doesn't get old.
It does not get old.
Welcome back to the Slow Hunch podcast. And this week is a special one for me, joined by Fred Wilson and Brad Burnham, my partners at Union Square Ventures, and the two that founded USV back in 2003. We, in this conversation, get into the history of their relationship, the history of the firm, the history of the technology arcs that they've been following for the last 40 or so years of their careers, and we weave together a lot of hunches and themes and threads of the internet, the tech ecosystem, New York City venture, platforms, protocols, AI, and where it's all going today. So with that, I'm thrilled to welcome Fred and Brad, and I hope you enjoy.
Really excited to have you guys here today. You've both been a really big part of my life and each other's lives, and have been central to the development of a lot of big things in the world in terms of internet technology and startup companies and venture investing. And I know that your story is not a one idea story. It's an accumulation of many ideas and many decisions. And so I'm really excited to talk to you about that today. Maybe we could start by having each of you introduce yourselves and talk about, or just say what you think if there's a slow hunch that you've been pursuing, over the last 20 or 30 years, what is it?
Why don't you start, Brad?
I'm not sure that was fair, but I will try. So Brad Burnham, been a partner at USV for, as we found out today, 22 years. And before that, I was a partner at AT&T Ventures, and before that, I did a bunch of different things for AT&T. The slow hunch that I have been following is that there is something about information and the technology that enables the flow of information that is empowering to people and is fundamentally transformative in many different ways. Something that I've thought about probably since college, where I studied political science and political theory and tried to understand the nature of power and how information and power interacted, and then transferred that into thinking about markets and how information impacts markets, and have been very privileged to be able to work on that problem slowly for my entire career.
I'm Fred Wilson, and Brad and I founded USV together, I guess, 22 years ago, although I think that's a little bit incorrect because I think it was more like the middle of 2003 that we really decided that we were going to do it. And I will say that teaming up with Brad helped me a lot because for the first, 15 years that I was in venture capital, I wasn't as idea driven. And I think it was really partnering up with Brad that helped me become more idea driven. And I think USV really represents an idea focused venture firm. And that really helped me become a better version of the investor that I was when we started USV. But I do remember going back all the way to my childhood that when I first encountered computers, they really inspired me in some formative ways. I was, for example, not very good at writing by hand, and
You have terrible handwriting.
yeah, I've actually got very bad fine motor skills, and I really struggled at writing as a kid, and I couldn't write more than like a one-page book report, for example. But then when I learned how to type, I could all of a sudden write 5 or 6 pages, and that opened a lot for me. And then when I started experiencing computers, the idea that digitizing things made them more useful was really important to me. And I do remember as a teenager, my brother and I were like playing records, and we were pulling records out of the record covers and putting them on the turntable and playing them. And I said to my brother, I was like, imagine if like all of this would just be on one big hard drive. Like every record that was ever invented was on one big hard drive, and we could just play whatever we wanted by just like pushing a button. And of course, that became the iPod. And now, of course, it all is on one computer in the cloud, right? It isn't even like each of us has a computer. I didn't get all the way to the fact that it would be in the cloud, but I did get, probably at age 15 to the idea that it would be much better if it was all on a hard drive. And so that, to me, the slow hunch of just like getting everything that had been analog to be digital would just open up a lot of opportunity was something that I'd had from a very young age.
And it sounds like you both came at the same idea, but in a slightly different way, in terms of the importance of, let's call it information or data, and what maybe computers would do to kind of open them up. But that way predated any idea of being an investor or having a career in investing.
Fred has a way of coming from the practical reality to an opportunity, and I tend to come from the theory down to the opportunity, and that's worked well.
When they meet, it's really great, right? So when Brad and I
Sometimes they don't.
But when Brad and I would agree about something, we were usually right about that because we were, like I said, like Brad said, coming at it, I think from a different place, but getting to the same place. I'm very pragmatic and want to get to an answer and want to get to a decision. And I've always felt that Brad's very principled and wants to get to the right decision and is not in a hurry, but will get there when he gets there. And so that's a tension, but it's a pretty healthy tension, right? Because someone who's very pragmatic needs somebody who's coming from first principles to keep you connected to that. But I think somebody who's very patient and wants to get to the truth in the real world, some urgency of like, but we need to make some investments is helpful.
That showed itself very early on when we sat down and decided to do this together. Fred's first instinct was to, okay, let's go, and my first instinct was go where, and so I sort of put the brakes on in a way and said, look, I don't feel comfortable going out and pitching a bunch of people about investing with us unless I know what I'm going to do. I, painfully maybe took Fred through probably almost 3 or 4 months of let's work through this. We found Carlotta Perez and a theoretical framework for where we were in the cycle of the market and everything else. I think that it worked well. I think it worked well in part because of where we were in the cycle of the market. If we were in a period of consolidation, I think it would not have worked and wouldn't have benefited from that. But we were able to take advantage of a moment, in part because we spent the time to do that.
Well, so maybe we can talk a little bit about how you guys met.
Okay.
When did that happen? How did that happen?
Brad and I met working on a company in the mid-90s called Multex. And I had led the seed round in that company at a firm called Euclid Partners, which was the first venture firm I worked at. And Brad's partner at AT&T Ventures, a guy named Alessandro Piol, he was a big guy and a big personality. And he had led that investment, and then I guess in the next round, whatever, the Series A, and then he had left, and Brad was essentially handed this investment to take over. And so Brad showed up in a board meeting, and the company was kind of a mess, like many things that we invest in are. And I just watched Brad kind of go to work very methodically, identifying the holes in Isaac, the founder's product and go-to-market plan. And Isaac was annoyed that Brad was picking it to pieces, and I was impressed. And eventually Isaac pivoted to the vision that Brad sort of had been articulating for a while, and then taking full credit for it, by the way. Full credit, like it was his idea. And Brad very wisely allowed him to do it because he understood that as long as Isaac got to the right place, it didn't really matter who got the credit. That company ultimately went public and got sold to Reuters for a good amount of money, and that was where we met.
I was seated in a room when Fred walked in the first time we met, and it was like this tornado walked into the room and made a huge impression on me. I also had the privilege of watching him work at that deal for a couple of years, several years, I think, before. But then we each went our separate ways, and Fred then went on to found Flatiron Partners and had a great run with that. I continued with AT&T Ventures for a bunch of years. And we didn't come back together, I don't think, until Dakota.
Brad has this great saying that it's important to do the right thing, not do things right.
It's not mine. It is a mentor of mine way back in the early days at AT&T, a guy named Rich McGinn, who went on to run Lucent. He used to say, you can be successful in two ways. You can be successful by doing the right thing or doing things right. And that's always been a guiding light for me, because you run into entrepreneurs who, iterate and iterate and iterate, but they execute well. And so that buys them the time to do things right. And ultimately they find a fit. And then you run into other entrepreneurs that are just riding this rocket ship because they happen to, stumble on the right thing very early on. And, I think Twitter would be an example of doing everything wrong, but doing the right thing.
Right. But Multex is an example of the opposite. Isaac was quite capable of doing things right, like building software, shipping software, getting customers, but he wasn't doing the right thing. And I felt, in hindsight, looking back, I had a lot of energy, but was mostly focused on doing things right, but not necessarily doing the right thing. And when Brad showed up and poked holes in it, I noticed very clearly like there was another way of thinking about what the company was doing that I hadn't really been feeling. It was pretty influential for me.
And so there was a moment where you each realized, okay, that other guy is interesting, and maybe it's helping me see the world a little differently, or maybe represent something I think is interesting or is complementary. And then a fair amount of time passes.
I'd say maybe like 5 years, maybe a little less, but could have been 3 or 4.
Well, an entire boom and bust.
Right. The internet boomed and then bust. The firm that I was at the time, called Flatiron Partners, effectively went out of business when the internet blew up in 2001. And Brad and his partners had the rug pulled out from under them by the new CEO of AT&T, who decided that he didn't like AT&T having a venture firm that he didn't control. Do I have that right?
Yep.
And so we were both out of a job for totally different reasons. And I was trying to figure out what to do next. I really wanted to stay in venture. And Brad had seed funded a company called Dakota, led by a guy named Dave Morgan, who's well known to everybody at USV because we've backed him several times now. And Brad invited me to angel invest in Dakota. And I did. And angel investing was part of my way of kind of figuring out what to do next. I joined the board of Dakota, and it was Brad and me and Dave. And Dave's great and brings a lot of energy, and it just felt like, hey, we're good at this. We can work with a founder like Dave, and you can bring the thing you do, and I can bring the thing I do, and we get the right founder, and it could be magic. That's really, I think, Dakota in my mind was really the thing that seeded USV, because that to me was like, oh yeah, we can be good together.
There's another piece that you're skipping over that made a huge impression on me, and that is the way in which you worked out from under Flatiron.
Yeah.
Because when we came back together at Dakota, you were still essentially triaging a very large portfolio that had been a very big part of the boom and then the bust. I had been a little bit more fortunate in a way to sort of have actually it was AT&T that decided to bring venture investing back in-house at the height of the bubble and sort of took us out of the market before the bust. And so I sort of stepped aside. Fred had to, go all the way through that. But the way he stuck with portfolio companies, worked out the problems, triage, saved the best, and then managed them. I got to see all of that because we were on the board together at Dakota while he was doing that. And so that made a huge impression on me.
You each came from venture with different flavors, and maybe there were things about it that didn't feel the best. And I know that when you started USV, you had an idea of what kind of firm you wanted it to be, and you designed it in a very intentional way.
Going back to the two ways to do things right or do the right thing. My skills in venture were a lot about doing venture right. And so Brad talks about like working out the portfolio, triaging the portfolio, staying with the companies, being there for the founders, like sticking it out for the long haul. That's very much about like how to do the venture business right. Yep. And I feel very strongly about that. And I had that even then in my DNA. What Brad really taught me was how to do the right thing, which is what to invest in. Like I was just like, we're just going to invest. Like I said to Brad, we're just going to invest in the internet. like that'd be great. He's like, yeah, but Fred, like there's a lot of the internet. Like where are we going to invest? So I think when you think about USV, I think it's two people who both had a lot to bring, and we both brought it. And USV, I think, does both of those things. I think we do venture right, and we also do the right venture.
I'd like to think so. Well, let's talk about that moment then. Not just when you decided to work together, but you decided to work together on a certain type of thing with a certain type of firm. How did that come together? What was that process like?
I would say Brad led that process, and it was a lot of reading and a lot of meeting people and talking to people. But Brad, maybe you can talk a little bit about how you thought about it.
It's really important to think about where we were in the market cycle, where we were at the time that we started. So this was 2003, 2004. We'd had the collapse in 2000. That had a profound effect on our business because two things were going on at the same time. The first was that we were in the midst of a generational transition in venture capital. There were a series of firms that had been founded in the 80s where the senior partners were beginning to cede some control over, their funds to the younger partners. And those younger partners ran with that in the 90s and rode the bubble and got very excited about the internet, made a bunch of investments, perhaps overinvested. We had the collapse, and then we had the senior partners kind of reasserting themselves, saying, wait a minute, we're going to go back to doing switches and routers and chips. That's hard tech. That's where the money is. This was a flash in the pan. It was not a great idea. And so what that meant was two things about the business. One is that it left the applications layer of the internet wide open because there was just not a lot of money going to that market when we came into it. And we felt pretty good about this. And this has a lot to do with, the work that we did. It actually, I was first introduced to it by Bill Janeway, and he had found this Argentinian economist, Carlota Perez, and she had written this book about financial bubbles and capital, and it just felt like we had been through that infrastructure phase, and we are now beginning to see the opportunity to invest in the applications layer. So that is what we ended up working through and committing to. And so we had a lot of conviction about it at the same time that the industry broadly did not.
What's interesting, though, is when we went out to raise capital, we had, I think, a really tight story about where we wanted to invest. Most of the people we pitched actually weren't prepared to hear that story. They were not even excited about investing in the internet, right? It was a very challenging time to raise a fund, and we ultimately prevailed, but it took us somewhere between 12 and 18 months. I think we got to a first close in about 14 or 15 months, and then it was, like 18 to get to the final close. And it took a couple of younger, more forward-thinking people in large endowments and institutions who understood our story to say yes. And then, like almost any financing, it came together because there was enough people doing it. But it was really hard for a while.
I remember hearing that you had something like 80 or 100 no's.
For sure.
Got a single yes.
Yeah, we had people falling asleep in our pitches. I mean, it was bad. It was really bad.
We had people walking out. You felt pretty small at that point. I mean, you just like.
But we believed. Here's the interesting thing. I don't know if it was like, for me, I think maybe it was like I didn't know how to do anything else. Right? I'd basically been a venture capitalist my entire adult life. So I was like, well, I got to make this work. Like it's the only thing I know how to do. So we just kept going at it. We didn't lose heart, and we just kept. And we did really, really believe we were at the right place at the right time, and we understood what to invest in.
During that time when you were getting 10 no's, 20 no's, 50 no's, 70 no's in a row, did any of that cause you to say, maybe we're barking up the wrong tree here, maybe you got the wrong idea?
We had both invested in the internet. We had both had successes in the internet. We both believed that, this was a fundamentally transformative new infrastructure. So that was never in doubt. What I learned, at least in that process, was that limited partners, fund investors, yeah, the thesis is sort of interesting, but that's, they're looking at things like track record and have you worked together, and is this a first-time fund? And frankly, several of those things were against us. This was a first-time fund. It was a first-time fund which we were taking to market at a time when a bunch of the limited partner community had made a series of investments in the late 90s in first-time funds that had all kind of collapsed in the post-bubble. We never had a doubt in the thesis, but I came to at least understand why we were having such a struggle.
But eventually, somebody said yes, and you got put in business as USV. Correct. So that was a big moment.
Well, yes and no. It's a funny moment because I got the call from Linda Lakeman at UTIMCO saying, we're going to do your fund. And I said, I think, thank you very much, and hung up. And I think I'm not sure you were in the office that day. I mean, I'm pretty sure I walked in your office and said, hey, we got UTIMCO. I didn't understand the implications of that, but they made a $25 million commitment to a $125 million fund, followed very quickly by the state of Oregon. And at that point, all of a sudden there was scarcity in the fund allocations, and we were dealing with people, begging us to get in. It's just,
we had a few other people like Jamie Spirins, who was at the time at Morgan Stanley, who liked our story, but for whatever reason wasn't going to say yes. And he was just sitting on the fence and waiting to see if we could get some real commitments. The minute we got those two commitments, he was like, okay, well, I'm in, right? And then And there was a few other people like that. Jamie comes to mind mostly because I think he really got it. He's one of the few people that when we pitched it, he was like, yes, this is right. But even so, he wasn't really willing to lead. But he did follow very quickly. And so it came together pretty fast after that.
There had been all this carnage in internet investing and internet applications, but you really felt there was a moment that new things were going to spring up. What was it like at the beginning as you started to invest along what you thought was the USV thesis of that time? What did the first few investments teach you about what was?
We started pretty slowly. I think maybe made 4 investments in our first year. That first fund, we took 4 years to invest. There were a couple of investments we made that were very formative. A great example is a company called Delicious, started by a guy named Josh Achter, and he sold it to Yahoo pretty quickly. It was a bookmarking service in the cloud. So when you found a web page you liked, you bookmarked it, but you didn't bookmark it to your browser, which was the conventional approach at the time. You booked it to effectively a web service in the cloud. And then the big thing about it was that people would leave tags, and then you could follow those tags. So if you were following the T tag, you would see anything that anybody bookmarked. So it was an open and social bookmarking system. And so much about that company was important and formative, and we were all in on it. And we didn't make a very large investment. It was maybe $1 million or $2 million.
Sounds right.
Really kind of tiny, and I think we made maybe 10 million when it sold. So it wasn't that impactful to the fund, but I really think it validated a lot of the ideas that we had when we went out to raise the fund. It also taught us a few things. Social was emerging. These big open platforms that were emerging, they started to call it Web 2, and we were like, yeah, okay, that's the thing that we were kind of talking about but didn't have a name, and so that was very helpful. So the thesis continued to develop over time in the course of that fund.
One thing that's interesting to me about Slow Hunches is that oftentimes you have an idea but don't know what to call it.
Right.
And then eventually somebody comes up with a name or a word that just crystallizes something and makes it more clear, and then that draws more attention and clarity and momentum. So I think that's really interesting, because if I understand the thesis of USV 2004 fund, which was the first fund, it was about the application layer of the internet being an open opportunity. But the story of Delicious is not just about the applications layer of the internet. It's about a new style of application where you connect all the people from all the different places and you put the data in the cloud, and it becomes more of a network than just a piece of software. That's a really big idea that became known as Web 2 or, the social web. But that idea, well, you didn't have a name for that in 2003.
It was a very exciting and heady time. I was writing a blog, and I could find something interesting to write about every single day. The dirty little secret about my blog is that many of the ideas on my blog were Brad's ideas that he would come in and talk to me about for 15 or 20 minutes. And then the next morning I'd write a blog post and take full credit for these ideas.
Well, that's worth talking about, because I remember having conversations with our limited partners where they were saying, does Fred actually do any work? And because he was writing, right? That was a brand new idea. We had limited partners who were saying, wait a minute, you're spending all this time writing, you're giving away all of your best ideas. This makes absolutely no sense to us. How could this possibly work? And yet we both intuitively believed in it. And it turned out to be maybe the first real blog in the VC industry. And we very quickly understood that, it's just a Bill Joy thing that you say that there are more smart people outside the company than inside the company. And we found many of those people as a result of this dialogue with the marketplace. And now it's like you can't be in the business without talking to the marketplace. And so that was a big unlock, I think, for us.
But that in itself led to some investments, because blogging, I think, in many ways was the first version of social media. And of course, we got Twitter and we got Instagram, we got TikTok, we got YouTube, not in that order, by the way. But because we were really all in on blogging and understood that putting your ideas out there got people to follow you, we started to see social emerge and these social platforms emerge, and that allowed us to understand the potential for how big they could be and allowed us to make some early important investments in that category. And I remember, like in 2007 and 2008, writing a lot about how I thought that social would perform better on an advertising basis than search. At that time, that was a very contrarian view. Like, how could you ever outperform search? Search is where all the intent is. How could anything be more valuable than intent? And I just thought that social potentially, because of the instinct for people to follow other people and everything, could actually be more valuable. I don't know that social outperforms search, but it's certainly of the same order of magnitude as search. That was a very unconventional view at the time, and we believed it.
Right, and that led to
Twitter, Tumblr, Zynga would be the ones that I would point to, and a bunch of others that didn't work.
I have a very clear memory of sitting in the Twitter office in South Park with Ev and Jack. And, I don't remember how we got to that
The
office.
way we got to it was that I was in San Francisco maybe 2 or 3 weeks before that. And I took a meeting with a founder in that same office. They didn't have the whole office. It was like kind of a shared founder space. That founder said, yeah, this Twitter thing is really interesting. And it just occurred to me that I should reach out to Ev. So I reached out to Ev and I said, I'm in San Francisco. I heard you're thinking of spinning Twitter out of Odeo. We'd love to finance that spin out. Can we talk about that? And he said, yeah, why don't you come back in a few weeks and meet with Jack and I, and we'll talk more about it. And so I said, okay, we got to get on a plane and go. What was so interesting about that was that they interviewed us. Mm-hmm. We never got a pitch from them. We went in saying, we like this, we want to invest in it. We didn't commit to invest in it, but we gave them the sense that we would. And so they spent the hour and a half that we had really digging into what we thought they should do in terms of go-to-market, how they should bring Twitter to the world. And we were very long. There's an API, let other people build on the platform, focus on the social, focus on the web. And they were getting pitched by other VCs. This is a text-based thing. This is a mobile thing. Go make deals with the carriers, really blow it out with a sort of a carrier-centric go-to-market. We were like, we don't like that idea. We think that's a bad idea. You already have this sort of inherently social viral thing going. Just go with that. And they called us back. We didn't have an idea whether they liked what we said or not, but they called us back. Ev called me back and said, we like you guys because you want to do what we want to do. What are you thinking in terms of amount and price? And so we sent them a term sheet. But what's so great about that is that's exactly what founders should do. They found the VC that was aligned with them on how they wanted to run the business, and they took the money from somebody who wanted to go where they wanted to go.
They were being pushed by other investors to monetize the minutes that they were putting on the texting networks. And this is part of, gaining conviction about what's important and where it's headed. We were perfectly comfortable saying, no, we don't need a near-term monetization strategy at all. We did not, I don't think, in some ways we were ultimately disappointed with the monetization strategy that Twitter developed because it forced them to move away from some of the openness that we'd encouraged them to follow. But we didn't need to see that. And, I think had we not done the work to build conviction around the value of these networks, we wouldn't have had that.
It's really one of my great regrets. I mean, you can't be regretful about an investment that is so transformative as Twitter. And the returns we made were phenomenal. But I think we knew that Twitter was essentially a protocol. And had we had the conviction that they could monetize it as a protocol, and had we really pounded the table at the board to do that, I think Twitter could look like Ethereum or look like Bitcoin today. And it just, the timing didn't line up. the idea
I
that
think you're being too hard on yourself there, because there was no framework for thinking about that. The best we could do is look at something like open source and Red Hat and something like that. And the best we could imagine at that point was like a Red Hat business model, which wouldn't have been
no,
that exciting.
that was not the right answer. But that's why the timing was unfortunate, because if we had waited another 3 or 4 years to commit to a business model, which I don't think Twitter could have waited, then it would have been clear that that would have been available to us. Ethereum is worth 450 billion or something, right? And Elon bought Twitter for 45 or something. So it's like a 10x, potential opportunity. But leaving the money aside, like what Twitter as a protocol could be for the world versus Twitter as this media megaphone owned by a single guy, God, that's a missed opportunity in my mind.
And maybe it's still an open opportunity.
Someone else's opportunity, maybe ours.
What's interesting about this whole conversation to me is you're trying to think about how things could be different in the future. I think you had an instinct about openness being important, right? And so, and the cloud and social, but sort of openness being better than closedness. And the intuition with Twitter was, boy, it'd be better if we could open it up to developers, if we could open it up to other clients, if we didn't have to lock it down. But even before that, there was an intuition that we can be more open by having an ad-based model versus having a subscription model.
That's what Google taught us, right? Google taught us that you could sell software with an advertising-based model, and they did that and competed very effectively with Microsoft, who had, a more outdated, licensing model. The idea of freemium as a business model where you give it away for free and some percentage of the users decide to pay for some power features, that emerged in the 2000s as a business model. It had not really existed because how could you have actually made that business model work without the internet and all that?
And so in some ways where Twitter ended up with its business model was a very modern model compared to the 90s and the early 2000s.
Right.
But it couldn't go as far as it might have gone in terms of being more open because that type of business model maybe hadn't been invented yet. Like, how do you monetize a protocol, for instance?
Right. And what was going on at the time was that Bill Gross was buying up Twitter clients and trying to effectively fork the protocol. We didn't call it that at the time, but looking at it back now, that's exactly what would have happened. And he had accumulated, I don't know, maybe 20 or 30% of all Twitter users on these clients that he bought. That felt like a existential threat to the business, and that led to the board deciding to lock down Twitter and not allow third-party clients, which I don't think many people understand. I don't think people understood that decision was a reaction to an existential threat. I think people just thought that the Twitter did something because they wanted to do it. I guess it's the same thing at the end of the day, but it is a little different. And if you had a protocol with a protocol token, you could have a shared incentive structure that would allow somebody like Bill Gross to go in and amass a reasonable amount of market power without necessarily creating an existential threat. But again, we didn't understand all that. It was 5 or 10 years too early.
And so when that all went down with Twitter sort of closing and the Bill Gross, client acquisition story, that was when, 2010?
2011, I don't know, around then.
So that's an interesting year because that's also right around the time when Bitcoin was invented.
2009, January 2009, I believe, is when the white paper was published.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so if you think about the timing of those two things, it's very interesting timing. And to me, it explains, or it helps explain a lot of why USV was interested in Bitcoin early. I joined at the end of 2011, and I remember shortly thereafter, we were talking about what is Bitcoin. And I think the dominant view of Bitcoin at the time was internet money, which is not, or internet gold, which is not incorrect, but it's also not the whole story. And I think we started looking at it as, oh, actually, this is a computing protocol, sort of like HTTP, sort of like SMTP, but that can store data in it and can capture value in it. And this idea of Bitcoin as protocol was a really, really big idea. And then Albert published, you remember Albert published a blog post, I think in 2013 called Bitcoin as Protocol, which was the result of maybe a year's worth of discussion inside USV about the ability for a new generation of protocols to emerge that could do really different things, could solve some of the problems that you were sensing during the Twitter days.
For me, the first piece of pattern recognition around Bitcoin was this idea of a permissionless network. And we'd had it already with the internet.
Right.
For me, it was just like this raw pattern recognition, like, oh, this very reminiscent of something that was big, big, big and influential in my life. And this feels like it's going to happen all over again. Like everything at USV, I came in with a ton of energy for this thing, and Brad and Albert and everybody else, it sounds like you were just arriving at that time. It ended up in a very long conversation, and we debated and discussed it, and ultimately Albert had some important insights to contribute around this being a protocol, which I think unlocked a lot of things for us as we thought about how to invest in it. For me, that's how it first happened.
I think Vitalik did come into our conference room at USV with this group of people from his hangers-on. That's an example of us intuitively understanding that there was something really important here, but then also having, frankly, I had a sort of a negative reaction to the people surrounding that group at that point. There's always a trade between, backing the people and backing the idea. And, that's an example where the idea was much more important and powerful. I mean, the central person, Vitalik, is a very special person. But he was so young at the time, and he was surrounded by folks that I didn't like as much.
Right.
People come at crypto from a lot of different ways, and some come from more from a financial lens, and some come more from an internet lens. I've always thought of USV as having this aha moment about, oh, Bitcoin is like the internet, as opposed to Bitcoin as a new kind of money.
Right. And you can see that in the investments that we made early on. We invested in storage as a protocol, Filecoin. We invested in identity as a protocol, which ultimately became Stacks, but it was
one name.
One name.
First. And this was a very early idea. Manib and Ryan from that project had the idea that found fundamental and profound idea that not only could we do computing, low-level computing primitives, but that you could actually have a digital identity on a blockchain stack that you had more ownership over. That was in 2014.
Yeah.
Really early, and a really huge idea that is still a really huge idea.
Right. I think we were too early. Filecoin has been a success, but we were too early to some of those ideas. I think what we needed in hindsight to happen was for Ethereum and smart contracts to emerge and a programmable substrate to exist that then you could build on top of.
I think there's a tension, there has been, and I probably will continue to be a tension in the crypto asset and blockchain space around how it's viewed. Is it viewed as a speculative, environment where everybody's just there to get rich quick and cash out? Or will it ultimately become viewed more like the internet is viewed as a fabric, for digitally native fabric for transactions, data, communications that has these special properties?
If you talk to the people who are building in the space, that's what they're building. If you talk to the people, I mean, certainly there have been people in the space who saw an opportunity to create something, and there was an ICO boom and bust. But the engineers, distributed systems engineers who are building this are building for all of the reasons that we believe in, that an open system is more generative than, siloed closed systems, that, users should have more control over a data asset, that shared data assets allow for composability. And all these themes are very, very present in engineers that we work with on this.
One of the things that we struggle with at USV is the role that the large companies in tech play in the overall tech environment. And, what we've seen over the last 15 years is companies like Apple and Google start to lock down a lot of this inside their own closed systems. And crypto for us has been a little bit of a way to fight against that. Another area I think that we have concerns around is AI. If AI is only available to companies that can afford the billions of dollars that it takes to train these large models, then it's going to be companies that startups that have raised billions of dollars, and then the big tech companies. And so one area in AI that's been very interesting is some of the ideas behind crypto can marry AI, decentralized training and decentralized infrastructure and things like that, in the hope that we end up with an open AI infrastructure as opposed to a closed AI infrastructure. And like that's kind of a raging thing right now inside of USV, and how that's going to play out.
And in one way that I've always thought of part of the slow hunch of USV is, and actually we wrote about it in last year, our updated thesis statement is around empowering the edge.
This emergent, decentralized, bottom-up innovation is so much more generative because, frankly, starting my career at AT&T and seeing the difficulty of getting interesting things done in large organizations, when you get to a certain scale, you have so much of a vested interest in existing structures and everything else that you're not willing. But if the market allows for that innovation to emerge outside of these large organizations, it's a huge win.
It's a really interesting moment because on the one hand, AI is this highly consolidating force where you need billions and billions of dollars to train these models, which is why we're looking at decentralized approaches and so on and so forth. At the same time, it's never been a better time to build.
I had breakfast with a friend who built an app over the weekend. She didn't write one line of code.
Right.
That's pretty amazing.
Right. And the Web 2.0 version of that is, we didn't have to rack our servers and run all this stuff locally. We used, AWS, right? It's kind of sort of like that, right, where it's just getting easier and easier to build. And so I guess my point is there's oftentimes these tensions between freedom and openness and consolidation, right? The fact that OpenAI and Anthropic and all these companies have invested these billions of dollars, on the one hand, gives them control over the market for now, but it is also unleashing, open innovation at a crazy rate.
What we hope it's not like is when platforms like Facebook and Twitter gave people new social infrastructure to build on top of, and then lots of people went and built stuff, and then they closed it down, and those people were left hanging, right?
We talked earlier in this conversation about our commitment to the applications layer of the web. And when we first started investing in that applications layer, I don't think we fully understood network effects. We intuitively understood and wanted to support this emergent innovation and this openness. And so that led us to the applications layer. We later came to understand network effects. And then we invested, enthusiastically in those. What we didn't fully understand at the time is how powerful those network effects were going to be. And that's what led to the consolidation around Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon. And so, having seen that movie, are we, approaching AI in a different way? Are we approaching AI perhaps a little bit looking over our shoulder and thinking, are we missing something? Is there a vector of consolidation here that we're not seeing? Like, there's the obvious, capital requirements associated with, training a big model, but, is there some other element? We're going into this trying to find those opportunities that can, basically lock in structural openness instead of allowing for that consolidation. And if we can do that, I think we're in for a really, really exciting next few years.
We talked a lot about the evolution of some of the big ideas that have been part of the slow hunch of Union Square Ventures, mostly focusing on the things that maybe we got right. Curious, looking back, like anything that you feel like you got wrong?
Oh, I've got a bunch. We're talking about the anti-portfolio, the things that we passed on, right? I think probably I am in part responsible for, let's say, passing on Airbnb. When Airbnb was pitched to us, it was literally pitched as an air mattress. And I was too old to sleep on the living room floor on an air mattress. And, I just said, this doesn't, so lesson there that, boy, I have to learn again and again and again is that you are not the market. putting yourself in that position is a really terrible idea as an investor. Understand who the market is, understand who's going to use this product, but you are not the market. And so that's one. Square,
Yeah.
we passed on.
After going through the Twitter experience and working closely with Jack, I just, for whatever reason, just didn't see payments as like the place that he was going to go next. And I just didn't have an open enough mind around that he could do for payments what he had done in social and create something amazing that the world wanted to use, which he did.
We understood how difficult it was to play into the existing financial services market, and he was front-ending the existing. We had the exact same problem with Stripe. The Collisons came in before they took their first round of financing and presented to us, and it was like, wow, energetic, smart kids, working on an interesting problem, but they're messing with this regulated industry that has all this entrenched market power, and how are they going to play into it? Well, in both cases, I think we missed developers. We missed developers as the customers, as opposed, and that understanding that all of a sudden there was going to be this whole new marketplace, online that's going to be playing in, that's being served by developers that are going to need a back end. And I think we didn't see that. I didn't see that.
One big blind spot that I had when we invested in Coinbase, we invested in a company, a very traditional company that was building on top of Bitcoin, right? And I thought that's great. Like that's the way to invest in Bitcoin. A few years later, we hired an analyst named Joel Monegro, and Joel said to me, Fred, like, why didn't you just buy the Bitcoin? Like, just, why did you need to invest in Coinbase? This was maybe a moment where I'd just finished reporting to the team that there was some management upheaval at Coinbase, and Brian was going to have to hire some new people to run parts of the company, and it was, causing him some stress and me some stress. And Joel was like, why go through all that trouble? Just buy Bitcoin, And I was like, but Joel, we don't buy Bitcoin. Like, we're a venture capital firm. We invest in startups. Bitcoin's like not a startup. He said, I think you're wrong about that. And he said, these are protocols and these are the protocol tokens and you need to be investing in them. And of course he was right about that. We, of course, corrected, and, we've been investing in tokens and protocols for almost 10 years now. But I didn't understand that when we wrote the check into Coinbase. I didn't even think that maybe at the same time we should buy some Bitcoin too, or maybe just buy Bitcoin. I mean, I'm very glad we invested in Coinbase. It's worked with an incredible group of people, and it's just been a great experience. So I'm really glad we did that. But the idea that we could have also bought Bitcoin, like, that would have been smart. The other thing I said to Joel, I remember this conversation so well. I said, Bitcoin's like Facebook. It's publicly traded. Like, our limited partners do not hire us to go buy publicly traded stocks. They can do that themselves. And he said, Fred, they're not going to buy Bitcoin. And of course he was right about that. They still don't buy Bitcoin. It's, some of them do now. But like 10 years later, most of them are not buying Bitcoins. His point was like, you will be doing them an enormous favor by buying Bitcoin because they're not going to do it.
I'm really proud of the way that USV has been willing to change. This came to me, was really etched in my mind with our experience with Tumblr. That, when we made the first investment in Tumblr, I think it was a $350,000 investment. And we had, a very small piece of the company for that. And it was like, well, that makes no sense. I mean, the reason we were able to make the investment is that everybody else throwing money at David Karp was saying, I need to own 20% of the company and you need to take a check for $5 million. And he said, I don't need $5 million. And he didn't. And so the thing that Tumblr taught me is that the economics of the web are such that we have this shared infrastructure that we're all paying for because we pay for our internet access that we're riding on top of. And I can grow, my costs grow as the size of my network grows. I don't have this big investment in software up front and infrastructure up front or research and development up front that I need to capitalize with venture capital and then pay a return on. And so, we ended up, I think, having about $7 million in Tumblr by the end, but we just kept putting money in. And that was a brand new muscle for a venture capital firm at the time.
Yeah. I also was amazed that David and Marco, who was the other person that was working on Tumblr with David when we invested. It was just two people. And they got a very long way, just two people. I think they went another year or 18 months before they hired a third person. Like they got Tumblr to a very significant
I think of it
scale.
as 20 million users and two people, right?
Think about that. It's incredible.
Which maybe somebody will do in the AI world.
You build up infrastructure layers that are capital intensive to build, but once they're built, they really open up the playing field, right? And that was true for the internet itself. It was true for kind of the base of the social web. Blockchain and crypto networks are another form of that infrastructure that are now open and buildable. And then here we are today with AI models being the next version of a massive infrastructure that took a huge investment to make, but that now has opened things way up. And so, at each of those turns, I guess it caused USV to think a little bit differently about how to invest at that moment. And we're at another one of those turns now, I think.
Right.
Well, watching the consolidation around Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon on Web 2, and then seeing Web 3 emerging, having had the experience with Twitter and closing off the fire hose, and then seeing Web 3 as an infrastructure that can't be evil, not just promises not to be evil, but can't be evil, that begs the question of what is it about AI and the training models? Is there a mechanism that we can envision that can't be evil in AI, and what will that look like? It's going to have something to do with openness. It's going to have something to do with access and the inability for a platform to do a rug pull on all the value adders on top of that platform. And I think that's a really interesting part of the conversation.
Another idea from Stephen's book that the Slow Hunch comes from is something he calls the adjacent possible. So it's another reason why change doesn't happen immediately. It happens incrementally because you can only open the door that's adjacent to the space you're in now. Once you get into the next space, you can open the next door and the next door and the next door. Fred, I think you wrote something on your blog recently to the effect of, it's hard to remember a time where there's as much opportunity for innovation as there is right now, which is a really interesting statement.
One of the things that's really exciting to me is that over the last few years at USV, we have extended our investing aperture into some new areas like energy, the energy transition, and starting to, make a couple of investments in biology. And what is so obvious is that our legacy franchises in software and AI and Web3 are going to be really useful in these new areas,
Yep.
right? And that might not be as obvious to somebody who has just been investing in bio their entire life or just investing in energy, but because we are investing across all these sectors, we can see how AI might change biology, or we can see how Web3 might change energy.
It's interesting because it's reminiscent of early USV 2003, 2004, where because of the investment in the core internet, it was possible to do new things at, let's call it the applications layer, the use case layer. It sounds like you're saying the same thing, but with a new set of primitives that include crypto and AI.
Right. So AI infrastructure is largely these large models that have been trained with billions of dollars and now can just be accessed via an API call. Web3 infrastructure is the idea that 1 million people can turn on their computer and collectively do something, mine Bitcoin or train a model or anything. And as Brad pointed out, there's enormous amount of innovation in decentralized computing to make that happen. It didn't just, people just didn't turn on a bunch of computers and it worked. Decades and decades of software has been built to make that work.
And add to the list of capabilities that crypto gives, it's global instant payments. It's turning everything into a digital asset that can be used to create an incentive to, build a new business model.
Right, exactly. And so what's exciting for me is how all of these areas that we're investing in touch each other and create these adjacent possibles.
Yep.
I share Fred's enthusiasm for what will soon be possible and what is emerging right now. I also worry a little bit that we are still in this era of consolidation. One of the things that USB has always focused on is empowering individuals, empowering the edge, empowering entrepreneurs. I think one of the biggest threats to that opportunity is Apple. And it's not that Apple is in some way maliciously actually trying to prevent the emergence of this. It's just they're in this position where um, they have the privilege of being able to watch what happens in their app stores, watch engagement, and then integrate that set of services in a way that creates a user experience that's better than the siloed experience of in and out of an app for various different functions. You're seeing them integrate music and health and media consumption and everything else. And the question is, how is the relationship between convenience and familiarity interact with the opportunity that's enabled with openness and standardization? I'm obviously rooting for an alternative that will be more open and that will get the benefits of scale through standardization as opposed to platformization. That tension is going to play out over the next couple of years.
Well, I have a hunch, I guess we can call it a slow hunch, that AI might actually be the thing that breaks down these walls. And this is going to be a bad example, but I'll give it because it just happened yesterday. I made a playlist, my year-end music playlist on SoundCloud, and our colleague Jared said, "Gee, I really want to listen to that on Spotify because that's the service that I use to listen to music." And of course, those two services have a whole bunch of reasons, some that relate to their relationship with the music industry and what they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do, and some which have to do with their business model, that they don't allow interoperability between those services. But I said, why can't you just tell an AI to go look at my playlist on SoundCloud and go create it in your Spotify account? Like that's got to be easy to do, right? And so, like, as people become more and more comfortable just telling AIs to break down these silos, the silos are going to get broken down. And then once these silos get broken down, I think the people whose business models have relied on these silos may have to rethink their business models. So I have a hunch, and it's very half-baked at best, that AI and the user's ability to start to get AIs to do this work that would have been too hard for them to do otherwise,
Yes.
right? They're not gonna go one by one and go recreate the SoundCloud playlist over here, but they would be happy to just tell an AI to do it. So I don't know. I think the silos are going to get broken down because users are going to figure out how to break them down.
I agree that AI is going to turn out to be the mechanism that I mean, we're already seeing the ability to actually create apps or applets, very, very easily. And, and if you combine, you mentioned this notion of combining some of the features of Web3 or blockchains and AI. And if you combine those two and you begin to imagine the composability and the reusability of code and of data within these, there's something really interesting that's going to happen there. I have another thought about the relationship with AI. I mean, most of what people are talking about with AI right now are agents that are going to perform functions. And you described one, go reproduce a playlist for me. And, in some ways I can imagine that's a pretty safe thing to ask an AI to do because, what's the consequence of getting it wrong? But when you ask an AI to act for you in the world, to trade stock or make a airline reservation, there are a bunch of ways that it could go wrong. If it hallucinates in that process and creates, a portfolio for you that basically, incinerates your net worth, that's not a good thing. And so people are going to have to build these very important guardrails around what AI can do. The coding will be super simple, but the guardrails will be very complicated, and we'll have to look at lots of exceptions. Turn it around and say, well, maybe what AI is going to do is more empower individuals to make choices more effectively. And so it's going to organize information on the input side in ways that allow individuals to be much more effective. And where that gets to be really exciting is, completely rethinking the nature of humans' interface to information. And right now we have some fairly old models that were designed around functionality. Like I want to be
Right.
able to, manage a spreadsheet or, file something or type something or whatever. Everything has kind of grown up in this notion of function. And we have today on the web a whole bunch of different silos that are each functionally organized. But wow, if you imagine beginning to organize those for individuals contextually, I think of it a little bit like all of us will have the briefing book that the President of the United States has on their desk every morning or they'll have an agent whispering in their ear, reminding them that, they have to be in this place at this time. I can envision a future where each of us is much more effective in pursuing the things that we want to pursue and that we believe in, unconstrained by the market power of dominant providers, which would be a pretty exciting.
It feels like we're at a moment where the form factor of the technology that we use every day might change in a dramatic way. In 2000, 2004, it was desktop software to cloud internet software. And now it went to mobile, and we've been in the app store, app silo world for the last 15 years. And it's possible that may change, and it may change quickly or slowly, I don't know. But this idea of AI helping us break down walls, helping us see things more cohesively with fewer, silos, is going to change, I think, the shape of how we use technology, and that feels like a big opportunity for someone.
Voice for sure. I remember when I was at MIT in the late 70s and early 80s, AI was pretty hot topic back then, and it took 35 years maybe for AI to live up to the expectations of what some of the computer scientists at MIT had in 1980 for it. But I think voice as an interface has been around for a long time. Google has had
Right.
voice on its phone for 10 years at least. But I really start to see more and more people using voice now to prompt AIs and to send text messages when they're in their car. And it's slowly but very surely becoming very normal for people to do. And once we have an intelligent agent on the other side of a voice prompt that can actually do real things as opposed to just kind of convert it into text, like we're really at the cusp, I think, of seeing some real unlock there.
The constraint is no longer the technology. The constraint is more and more becoming the human ability to manage the complexity of the information and the
Right.
transition from one model of interaction to another. And I think it's really interesting, to think about, who are going to be the early adopters of these new models. And it was pointed out to me recently that I think we all know this, that the early adopters of TikTok were tween girls. Why? They didn't have any prior commitment to a user experience that they were
Right.
familiar with. They weren't building
Right.
spreadsheets. They had no reason to think that this wasn't the right way to interact. They didn't have big friend networks that were,
Already on Facebook.
already on Facebook. And so boom, and so, one of the things that we have to be looking for here are where these new experiences are going to, blossom first, because boomers like us, like me at least, are going to have a hard time moving away from, I've spent an entire life learning how to manipulate this information environment, and I can make it work for me.
Right.
And I don't, it's going to be hard for me to learn a new one.
Well, we should probably start to wrap up here. I'll ask you a question which people ask me all the time. It's been 20 or 22 years since you started USV. You've been investing for decades, even before that. You've been doing this for a long time. Have had a lot of success. People often ask me, why are you guys still here? And I think Jared posted a picture on Twitter a couple weeks ago of the two of you sitting back to back in two rooms in our office, with the caption, like, these two guys are always the first two here in the morning, which is true. And I always talk about how, Brad, I know I'm going to find you sitting in the front of the office at 8 a.m. or whenever I walk in, if it's early. And so clearly you're still interested, still committed, like still curious, have threads you want to pull. But don't let me put those words in your mouth. How do you feel about what's next?
Well, for me, venture capital is a little bit of a crutch. I'm very curious, but I'm a little lazy in terms of doing the work to learn something. And venture capital allows me to learn all these new things without having to do a lot of work. I'm surrounded by a bunch of people at USV who are also curious about basically the same things. And so it's a collective learning environment. And then, of course, that's supercharged by all the founders who come in and explain a really deep domain. And I am blessed with the ability to understand things quickly. So if you give it to me in the right format, I can learn things very quickly. I can't get that anywhere else. I could potentially go get it at another venture firm, but I don't know why I would want to do that. I already have one, so why do I need to go get another one? But I can't give that up. I don't know where else to get that for what I need to be happy in the world, which is to be learning new things all the time. And so that's why I do it.
Ditto. But an additional nuance, I learned pretty late in life that I don't learn that effectively by reading, because the problem with reading is that most everything you read is 90%, stuff you've already learned. And there's this one insight in the middle of it that really makes you stop and think. When you're sitting across the table from an entrepreneur who's been thinking deeply about a problem for a long time, you can go, no, I get that part. Tell me about this. I don't get this part. And so it just zeroes you right in on, and it just accelerates your learning. And so same story, it's an incredible privilege to be able to, sit with smart people, talk about really interesting things. And at my point in my career, as I'm trying to step back, I like to say, smart people, cool things, don't take any to-dos, which is, a great spot to be in.
Yeah, it is really a wonderful thing to be able to, almost interrogate. And I realize when I'm with founders, I kind of do that. I realize that that's my UI. To interrogate a founder until I can understand what they're doing, right?
Yeah.
That is an incredible thing, right? Because there's a moment where you're like, oh, I get it. I know what you're doing now, And sometimes it doesn't take long. I could do it in 2 or 3 minutes if you let me, full on interrogate. That's for me the greatest way to learn. Like you said, Brad, it's a real privilege because they're only doing that because we can write them a check. They're not coming in to educate us out of the goodness of their hearts, but that's what we get from it.
And it doesn't get old.
Does not get old. Unless you invest in the same thing over and over and over again, which would be boring.
I know that entrepreneurs appreciate that level of engagement. Entrepreneurs often come into our office and they get this kind of engagement or interrogation, but it's coming from a place of curiosity. It's coming from a place of real interest, and they may have come from an office where somebody sat across the table and said, "Talk to me about your revenues in over the next 3 years." And
happens all the time.
And they're like, well, don't you want to know why we're doing what we're doing? And we tend to want to know why they're doing what they're doing.
I love, Nick, you just won a deal and you found out after the fact that the founder liked us best because you're amazing, but also because one of our partners asked him the hardest questions about the area he's working in that any VC had ever asked. So you're right. I think they do actually, the really good ones actually do like to be asked the really hard questions.
Well, with that, I'll stop asking you easy questions and say this has been a real pleasure. We talk about USV as being a conversation. USV is a slow hunch. It's a journey of exploration of how technology is going to intersect with the world and how to be part of it. It's been a real privilege for me to be part of that journey with you and to see how you think and see how you invest and see how you build a firm. It's been amazing to witness and to be part of. So thank you for sharing more of your time and insights here today.
Our pleasure.
you.